Welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for May 21st, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today by Matt Keyser, Jim Clausing, and Stan Nurilov. I'm Brian Rexroad. And today, I guess, Matt, you know, the first article here that we're going to cover, when I first looked at it, it sounded like something out of an Austin Powers movie. But can you tell us a little about it?
Sure thing. So researchers at the University of Alabama released a paper recently stating that there are specific ways to trigger malware on mobile phones. It's gotten a lot of heat, actually. What they're proposing is that it's possible for malware to be triggered, you know, the malicious functions of the malware to be triggered using sound, light, and vibration sensors on the phones. It seems a little bit cheesy to me personally because malware can be triggered in any sort of way. They come up with, you know, the idea is like, you know, if it hears a particular, you know, music in the room or lighting, flashing in the room, it would trigger the malicious functions. But to me, it seems like you could do the same thing with a timer. You could do the same thing with any sort of other input. It's not so much that you would see this in regular malware, but more that maybe there's a specific case, a use case for it. So to me, it seems a little bit overblown, but I guess that there are potentially some uses for it because one of the best ways to find out that malware is actually on a machine is to look for the command and control traffic. Now, if this command and control traffic isn't, you know, internet traffic, it's not going over a 3G modem or the Wi-Fi, but it is in fact sound or light or vibration, I suppose that's a good way to make it seem more quiet on the network. But in order to come up with the conditions in order to trigger that sort of command and control, I think it's either in the realm of serious spy fiction or not going to happen at all.
All right. Yeah, so there's a real question about whether this research has some practical aspects associated with it. Although, you know, I can imagine sort of a scenario if you really wanted some locality around a command and control activity, say inside a movie theater or in a stadium or something like that, there would be something you want to take into account. You know, perhaps some sort of a flash of light or a sequence of flashing or something like that. So I thought this was kind of interesting. It seemed to me it would have more application for, I would say, non-malicious purposes, you know, for where you might want, for example, to be, you could have downloaded an app and actually be a participant in the Super Bowl halftime show in some respect. So this is kind of fun.
Or if you go to a movie theater and it's too dark and your phone goes to vibrate automatically, it actually has some pretty cool features for an app.
Yeah, nice idea there, Stan. So it was very interesting, the notion of it being used for malicious activity. You know, I agree with you, Stan, Matt, that that's a bit of a stretch, but certainly something we won't want to ignore as we're going forward.
And I think the most important point to mention is, for those who didn't quite understand the technical aspects of the article, this is not an infection vector. Malware already has to be on the device in order for this to occur.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. So the next item here, there are actually a couple of slants to this. This was a article that, actually a story that Brian Krebs had done, and we actually had shared something from Brian Krebs last week as well. And this relates to actually a couple of slants associated with DDoS attacks, and particularly websites or tools that are available for hire to conduct denial of service attacks. And one of them was actually kind of an interesting slant that, in my opinion, I certainly don't have an opinion from a legal standpoint of whether this is a legal thing or not, but the argument here was that hosting a website and allowing users to use that for denial of service attacks, that is, to be able to provide denial of service attack services, is legal. And so there's an argument in that direction. Certainly it raises questions about whether it's ethical or not, and that's a sort of a separate issue. But that was sort of one point of view here. And then sort of the other aspect of this, which I find actually even more interesting, is this notion of the fact that they are using legitimate services to help facilitate that. So an example they pointed out was They're using, you can use PayPal to pay for the services. It's not a slight against PayPal by any stretch of the imagination, but it kind of points to, and there are other areas like this where sometimes there's perhaps not enough accountability associated with services that are provided on the Internet in terms of how they might be used or how they actually are being used in perhaps fraudulent or illegal services. So, for example, there have been studies that have pointed out that many DNS registries, domain name registries, actually have bogus information associated with them, many times deliberately bogus information, and there's even been some study that's claimed that the majority of new registrations are actually associated with criminal activities. And so there's a little bit of a adverse motivation associated with this. That is, the businesses are making money as a part of the criminal activities, and perhaps they're not really motivated to really do anything about it. Similarly speaking, there are hosting services that are used by criminal activities or malicious activities. Again, perhaps command and control servers that perhaps the hosting provider is more interested in the revenue than paying attention to who's using the services and how it might be contributing to invalid activities. So you can take a look at those the articles associated with this and develop your own opinion. I don't know, anybody else have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think about that, and I realize that for large businesses like PayPal, they can do something about fraudulent use of their service. But for smaller businesses, if you're just a startup and you're being abused by some other external, and there's really not much you can do about it unless you spin up your own fraud prevention and detection service. I think it's going to be a real hurdle to small businesses trying to come up with unique ways of doing business, especially payment processors, that they have this onus on them that not only do they have to be a business, they also have to be police of their own service. And in some cases, they may not be able to handle being both.
Yeah, good point, Matt. There are challenges all around this. Large and complex happens to be a challenge as well. So there absolutely, I don't mean to belittle the technical hurdles or the around this, but it is an area where it seems like if we want to reduce the malicious activities, making sure that there is appropriate accountability in those services is probably appropriate. And for example, we put an awful lot of effort into deterrence. That is, for example, we've been notifying customers associated with open DNS servers to help create a deterrent. And they're not DNS servers that we're operating; they're ones that are associated with the customers. But as a service to customers, helping them realize that they have an open DNS server, and in particular are being used as part of DNS amplification attacks. That requires a reasonable amount of effort to generate those reports, provide information to customers, interact with customers along those lines. And that's just one of many examples of things that we need to do to be able to minimize the amount of abuses that are taking place. So with that. So next story here relates to a service, and I guess this is more on the other end of it, making sure that the service itself is protecting the users. And Matt, can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure thing. So researchers at Heise Security in Germany recently discovered that when you send URLs over the Skype messaging service using the text messaging, that certain URLs are actually looked up by an IP address belonging to Microsoft. It's a little bit interesting that in the terms of service for Skype, they do say that they take measures to prevent spam and other malicious activities from going across their network. But the traffic that's being generated in this case does not appear to really serve that purpose. It's a head request to a website, typically for an HTTPS URL, and a head request really does nothing but turn back headers to you. No website content. So if you're looking for spam or phishing or exploit kits, a head request isn't going to get you what you want. So there's a lot of questions that are being bounced around right now as to why this is actually occurring. And it seems like there's not that many answers, unfortunately. Another thing that was interesting to note is that there's a time delay, it seems, between when you send your URL over the chat and when it actually gets looked up by this IP address. And as most people in security know, a lot of these web-based threats, they have a very short lifespan. So it would be in Skype and Microsoft's best interest to check those URLs as quickly as possible if what they were doing was actually looking for malicious activity. So right now, like I said, a lot of questions, not so many answers, and hopefully there'll be an official response from Skype in the near future.
Okay. Well, actually, this is one. I think it's important that we don't jump to any conclusions about this. I think, to your point, trying to do things as quickly as possible actually makes sense because, as you said, these malicious sites do tend to be fairly dynamic and move around and may not stick around for very long. But by the same token, it takes time to, realize the activity of actually checking things. I know that becomes one of our challenges, especially as the volume goes up. It makes it more difficult to do things in a more real-time basis. And by the same token, perhaps they've already checked, and the head request is just really to verify that the site hasn't changed. That's just one possibility that may exist.
Well, funny thing about that, the researchers at Heights of Security, and their work was also duplicated by several other independent researchers, set up randomized URLs on their sites, which were created expressly for the purpose of testing this functionality out. So they would create the URL, and then they would send it over the Skype service and wait. And there were no other hits in their logs besides coming from this one Microsoft IP address. Another interesting thing is that a lot of people have been using Skype for years under the impression that it's fairly secure and that there's end-to-end encryption. That means once your message comes from one side to the other, nowhere in the middle is it ever decrypted. But in order to do that, in order to do what the Skype service is actually doing, figuring out what the links are that you sent, they do have to decrypt it somewhere in the middle. So it may not be true that this has always been the case. I mean, Skype went through a change of architecture maybe in the last few years where it went from a very P2P, cloudy kind of way of passing messages to having larger supernodes and more of a centralized structure. So a lot of the old myths of how Skype works are sort of being shown to be no longer true in this case.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thanks for sharing that. That's some good information, I guess, and if to at least debunk any myths about perhaps the way people perceive Skype to work. Next item here, I guess, is a fairly rare occurrence, or at least had been in the past, and I guess becoming a little more frequently occurring. And Stan, can you tell us a little about what you found here?
Well, a couple of days ago, Ars Technica published an article about some MacOS spyware that was found on some activist's laptop. The interesting thing about this particular sample was that it was digitally signed with an Apple developer ID. Now, since, of course, this app developer ID has been revoked and that app developer can no longer sign applications or make new things. Another interesting thing about this malware sample, it was very similar to another variant of OS X malware that was found maybe several months ago. And the functionality of the sample was really more like spyware. So it took screenshots of the user's desktop and sent them on to some website, and then it gathered some additional information from the machine and sent it on to another website. And the spread for this particular sample, the one that was installed on this activist machine, was that it was spread via spear phishing, and its persistence was maintained through a logon script in the user's home directory. So those are the interesting things about the malware. Just goes to show that you can pretty much install a Trojan on any device.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, well, and the thing, this one was signed with using an Apple developer ID, but developer IDs, you can buy one for $100. It's not that it's all that difficult to get, or that it's necessarily adds a whole lot of security. There is some accountability there, but I'm not sure how much they trace back the actual identities of the users and all of that. So so, if you're willing to burn a PayPal account or something to pay for it, they're not that hard to get a hold of, and if the bad guys think they can justify the expense, once it's discovered, it'll be revoked, but I'm not sure that the bad guys think that's that high a hurdle.
Yeah, good point. So I guess it's sort of interesting here. We tend to think of sort of advanced persistent threats in sort of one category, and sort of the traditional malware in another category that's sort of the broad spectrum type thing, trying to infect whatever you can get to. And perhaps this one didn't really demonstrate a lot of sophistication. Maybe it's a learning process associated with the folks that are associated with this. But clearly there's a lot of gray space that fits between what those two categories that I mentioned, the APT versus the sort of broad spectrum. And this is a case where we're filling in a lot of the gaps between here. It's going to be very difficult as we go forward to be categorizing any particular piece of malware to be one thing or another thing, and makes it more challenging from certainly from a defender's point of view going forward as well. Okay, with that, I guess the next item here we have Jim, a little bit of discussion about certificates and IPv6, is that right?
Yeah, this one, this article was posted on the SANS Internet Storm Center by my friend Johannes Ulrich, who, I don't remember now exactly how he came across this in the first place, but it was an issue that he discovered with when you have both an IPv4 and an IPv6 version of your website. You may potentially have to have different SSL certificates if you're EPS on there. And in this case, he came across one where apparently some folks had forgotten about the fact that it was two different certificates. And so the IPv4 site had a new certificate, but the IPv6 site still had a certificate that expired about a month ago. So this was just another case of where with IPv6 we need to be thinking about these things and remembering that in this case we had two different certificates for the same name because one was running IPv4, one was running IPv6.
Right. IPv6 doesn't manage itself, does it? So perhaps it takes a little bit extra attention at this point.
Yeah, well, because it's something that we don't necessarily always think about. We've been doing IPv4 for so long, and IPv6, even though we've been talking about it for 15 or 20 years, it's only in the last couple of years that you've seen the big push because of the imminent exhaustion of IPv4 address space. Oh, and it's something that we don't always think about. And so this was just, Johannes came across this and got me thinking about it, and so I thought I'd mention it to our viewers and listeners here, just as something else they need to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, as a practical matter, the usage of IPv6 is still quite small. I mean, very, very small, probably well under 1% of the internet traffic as a whole. But as time goes on, there'll be more gravitating in that direction, and it's developing these habits, as you pointed out, is paying attention to the IPv6 as well as IPv4 activities, and obviously not forgetting the administrative responsibilities there.
Yeah, well, and with on IPv6 Day, World IPv6 Day last year, they were noting that there are parts of the world where there's a lot more IPv6 traffic than other parts, and in the U.S. we don't see nearly as much of it as in parts of Europe and Asia. So it's something that we sometimes tend to ignore until we have to deal with it.
Yes, absolutely. That's evident in the sort of historical allocation of address space. That is, a lot of the address space was gobbled up by the U.S. back when the internet wasn't really the internet yet. And since then, a lot of the developing countries have gotten little pieces and parts of address space and are sort of scrounging around for it more so. So it's kind of not unexpected that other parts of the world would be more progressive in terms of deploying IPv6 to be able to get a little more continuity in their address space and manage that. And certainly be able to address their capacity needs. And with that, we've talked many times about the need to get rid of passwords. And Stan, in fact, we've also talked a little bit about payment systems here. Stan, tell us about how we're going to get rid of passwords.
Well, I think it's going to be a long journey. Ars Technica published another article a couple of days ago about a push from the president of the FIDO Alliance, who also happens to be the Chief Information Security Officer at PayPal, Michael Barrett, about a technology that they propose, or actually an open standard that they propose for getting rid of passwords. And they have a whole scheme of things that are really technical about how to do this, but basically they propose that authentication be done through something like your smartphone or a device that you have, and you would authenticate once to your device, and then your device would automatically authenticate to the web service that you're really trying to get into. I know that recently Google also proposed something like that at their conference. So there seems to be a big push from several people from several alliances and consortiums to get rid of passwords and start moving into a different directions. I definitely encourage people to check it out at least, this article. It'll give you a quick overview of the proposals that they have, but definitely to get a real good look at what goes into it underneath, you would need to check it out with the Fast Identity Online Consortium and see what their proposal is. But it's for an open standard, and really you authenticate to your device instead of using a password.
All right, very cool. Yeah, I was just looking at their the FIDOalliance.org website as you were talking here, and it's very encouraging that their organization is trying to do this. I think one of the challenges, this kind of feels like the PKI challenge that we had years ago, where it's going to be very difficult to get, a lot of traction around a particular solution, but certainly to have, a variety of solutions, if so long as it's not dependent on a particular infrastructure or a particular, sort of czar of all identities, it should work fairly well, and it certainly be working in the direction of improvement. So very encouraging news there. Thank you. So, Jim, I guess the next point here, I mentioned a little bit earlier about the, blurring the lines between APT and more, widespread or general threats. And I guess there's a new report out that sort of points out perhaps another actor organization that might be involved in APT. Can you tell us a little more about that?
An interesting report came out just in the last day or two from Norman. They're a security antivirus malware analysis firm, and they were called in to assist when Norwegian Telecom reported that they had an intrusion. And the report that they put up there, which they call the Hangover Report, Hangover or Hanover being names that they give to the malware. The report is actually a fascinating read. The summary in the blog post goes over some of the details of how they tracked this back. But what they discovered was that it seems that there are a group of people that appear to be operating out of India that have a whole infrastructure put together for building malware to do these kinds of attacks. And what they discovered was, different versions, different programmers working on different pieces and different versions of this malware. The story of how they tracked it is kind of interesting, but they've put out a big report, and the appendixes of this report, 42 pages, that include some detailed information that could be used to look for this kind of attack traffic in your network or in your enterprise. They give indicators of compromise, MD5s of malware that they've seen, user agent strings that the malware used that were exclusive to it, IPs and domain names of command and control. So there's a lot of stuff in here. It's a fairly big report to read through, but there's some really good stuff in here and some useful stuff if you take a look at it for defending your networks. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I scanned through the report myself. I saw that and hadn't really had an opportunity to dig into it. Like I said, it's reasonably long, but certainly a lot of detailed analysis in terms of the infrastructure, showing how it's structured, how it operates, and well worth it. We'll provide a link for you here so that you can go ahead and take a look at it yourself and develop your own interpretation. Regardless of who's behind it, you certainly will want to take a look and see if there's any evidence of that sort of activity on your network. And I think one of the interesting points that they noted is there was a very obvious, at least from their perspective, a very obvious emphasis on activity toward Pakistan, so gaining insight into perhaps what's going on in that area. And I sort of got the impression that was one of the points of information that kind of suggested it might be tracked back to India.
Yeah, well, that was one of the big ones, and the other one was some of the debug strings that they found in the executables that that had names that appeared to be usernames that appeared to be possibly Indian names, and yeah, there were a number of things, but one of the big ones was the quantity of the malware that was targeted towards Pakistan. It was by far the majority of the stuff campaign that was all targeted towards Pakistan. Okay.
So let's take a little bit of a look at what's been going on in the last week related to Internet anomalies. And so first item that showed up on our list here is actually an increase in byte activity or bit activity, bandwidth usage associated with port 161 UDP. This is Simple Network Management Protocol, or associated with Simple Network Management Protocol. I didn't point it out in the graphic here, but it's actually source port 161 UDP that this is showing here. So this is pretty clearly denial of service attacks that are using SNMP reflection. We've talked a lot about this before, where they're using a spoof source address reflecting off of internet accessible SNMP servers and using that to cause the response activity to reflect toward a target of a denial of service attack. And in fact, we talked about these websites that are hosting denial of service attacks earlier. They didn't say specifically that they facilitate SNMP reflection attacks, but they did sort of allude to the fact or point out that they use DNS reflection attacks as a part of that attack activity, which is fairly prominent. So it would be reasonable to conclude that perhaps they also facilitate the SNMP reflection attacks as well. In any case, what we're showing here is sort of a trend, I would say, in the last couple of weeks here that shows an increase in the volume and frequency, the size and frequency associated with SNMP reflection attacks. And generally, taking a look at the targets associated with it, it looked like it was targeting basically the consumer base, which is also quite coincidentally, perhaps, consistent with the discussion we had earlier. That was the Brian Krebs article regarding sites facilitating, sort of commercializing denial of service attacks. Now, I'm showing two graphics here. It's the first one is showing specifically the source port 161 UDP activity. The second one is adding in evidence of fragmented packets. These are ones that actually show up on port 0, And there is it's difficult to see in the graphic here if you're looking at this. Is actually a composite, this bottom one here, a composite of both the 161 as well as the port 0 activity. And you can see that there is a correlation between the larger spikes on the top graph and the bottom graph, particularly in the last couple of weeks here. Now, there are other things that cause fragmentation type attacks. Specifically, an example is the DNS amplification attacks also cause this sort of activity. But the significance or the point here is that actually the largest portion of the contribution to the attacks is actually fragmented packet activity, which is consistent with an SNMP reflection attack. That is, when you send a request to an accessible SNMP server, many packets will possibly be in the response, and that is, in fact, the amplification factor. So we're seeing, perhaps a 10-factor plus increase in amplification associated with this. So the peaks here are roughly around perhaps a gigabit per second, certainly a lot more than a consumer account is going to be able to withstand, and likely is going to cause some sort of disruption. Next item here is scan probes on port 5038 TCP. We've been reporting on this for some time. This is the asterisk voice over IP management function. So that's basically a software-enabled VoIP platform. The largest spike that we saw here, this was actually on the, I believe, the 15th of May, so within the last week here. The largest spike was actually from a single IP address, or the largest contribution, a single IP address in Italy. That same source also was seen scanning on port 80 TCP. I'm not sure what the relationship between those two might be. There certainly are other sources doing scanning activity, not a real large number of sources, but an interesting observation here is that there are clearly different tools in use, which suggests that there are multiple actor groups that are pursuing these types of platforms and perhaps trying to get access to voice over IP platforms, possibly for voice spamming activity, or possibly just to anonymize themselves and maybe some type of a social engineering activity, or to perform toll fraud. Next item here is basically an increase in scanning activity that we're seeing. This is scan probes on port 25 TCP. This is, it's not unusual to see this sort of activity. There is still spamming going on in the world. It has been deterred to some extent, but part of this would likely be looking for SMTP servers that could be used for spamming activities. Of course, we can't rule out that they might be looking for some sort of exploit possibility on those platforms, but most likely looking for open resolvers. And by the way, one other option would be to use those as a relay point for phishing activities, phishing or even spear phishing activities to help hide the origin of those phishing activities. Next item here is to look at the top 10 most probe ports, and most of these are fairly typical. Port 445 is rather high up on the list. 1433 TCP, that's the Microsoft SQL database. Port 22 TCP, SSH. Port 3389, that's remote desktop protocol. And we do occasionally see port 53 UDP and scanning activity. It shows up here. Which is often or most likely looking for open DNS resolvers to facilitate DNS amplification attacks. Now, two that were new and a little bit different here, actually port 6666 TCP actually was the most prominent port in terms of scanning activity. It actually beat out port 445 TCP, which usually has the top ranking spot. And another one that showed up, 6672 TCP, which is related to that. So we'll take a little closer look at that one. In particular, when I investigated this a little bit further, there were tens of sources that were actually the most aggressive sources of scanning activity on these ports from China. And digging a little bit further into this, and when I say tens, I'm going to estimate maybe 40 or so sources. And these same sources were also acting together, that is, in terms of timing sequence, they were acting together and scanning other ports such as 6667, 6671 through 6675, and port 8080 TCP. So this kind of suggests that perhaps they were looking for IRC servers, and it's not clear what the objective might be. Maybe it's for command and control functions, or simply to dig in and see what's interesting about those. So what's interesting here, the graph is actually showing a composite of all of those ports that I mentioned, those 6667, 6671 through 6675, and port 8080. Normally, the most prominent port in terms of scanning activity that is probes here in particular is shown in green, which is port 8080 TCP, and then you can see this is an additive graph, so all of these contributions are being added together. And you can see there's a clear, abrupt drop in the port 8080 scanning activity as a very aggressive campaign on port 6666 and 6672 were pursued. So I'm not sure if they perhaps found something that they wanted to dig into a little bit further. There's also certainly a possibility that somebody entered something incorrectly from what they wanted to do here, but there was, for a short period of time, relatively aggressive scanning activity on those two ports.
Yeah, I was trying to remember the last time that 445 was not our top port on that. I'm not sure it's ever been in our top. Well,
hold on, because we're going to see that it certainly is in terms of the number of sources for doing the probing. But we have had some other times. I think I've seen 1433 actually top 445 sometime in the past. But you're right, the majority of times 445 gets the top slot. Just to show a couple more attributes associated with this scanning activity that was taking place yesterday. This is, I show this occasionally, what I call the probe aggression index. This is the number of probes versus the number of sources that are doing those probes. And it basically is showing how frequently a particular probe is taking place. And you see that your port 6666 and 6672 both have the two top slots in terms of how aggressively that scanning has taken place. It kind of suggests that a tool specifically for scanning purposes is being used as opposed to the normal TCP stack to do that. The next item here is what we call the reconnaissance index. In particular, this is a daily report that we generate to take a look at how much overall or aggregate scanning activity we see on the network. It takes into account the number of sources as well as the number of probes on the network. And we'll pretend like this little missing day is not there, and focus in on the recent activity. And you can see that even just yesterday, that more aggressive activity did show up on our reconnaissance index as an uptick in that activity. But generally speaking, we've seen a downward trend in the amount of scanning activity on the network, which is a positive trend. And last item here is looking at the top 10 most sources probing, and as usual, port 445 gets the top slot. We see the zero-access botnet P2P activity showing up in these ports that are in the 16,000 range, and the only other ones that really show up as being significant is port 23 TCP, that's telnet password guessing activities, and port 80 TCP, and there seems, perhaps it's just my impression, but there seems to be an awful lot of website exploit activity going on, password guessing activities against various applications associated with them, websites, SQL injection activities, that sort of thing. And so it's not surprising to see this port 80 showing up on here. Okay, and I guess next item here, I'd like to give folks an opportunity to raise their top concerns. And Jim, do you have a top concern for today?
Our thoughts go out to all those affected by the tornadoes in Oklahoma yesterday. And we've mentioned on this show in the past that after tragedies like this, the bad actors pop out of the woodwork trying to scam money out of people. And we've already seen a little bit of this. A good friend of mine, also a handler at the Internet Storm Center, actually spends a great deal of time after each of these investigating which of these sites are legitimate and which ones are scams. And we're already seeing in less than 24 hours some fishy sites popping up that look like they're trying to scam money out of people trying to help in the face of this disaster. So, as we say every time, if you want to donate money to help, do it through reputable organizations that you've done business with in the past, and don't look for these sites that pop up at the last minute. And
with that is our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can get in touch with us through email at threattrack@list.att.com. You can also communicate with us on Twitter at ThreatTraq is our handle there. ThreatTraq video is available on the AT&T Tech channel at att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube, and you can subscribe to an audio-only version on iTunes. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you, Matt, Jim, and Stan for joining us today, and your contributions are absolutely and always welcome. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, please keep your network safe. And finally, just wanted to share with you, it can wait. Don't text and drive.